The heat in the kitchen of Ruby's iron skillet was a living, breathing thing, heavy with the scent of paprika, slow-simmered collard greens, and the sweet, earthy aroma of cornbread rising in the oven. For Ruby, this wasn't just humidity. It was the atmosphere of home. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, her eyes darting to the clock. Lunch rush was over, but the anxiety that had settled in the pit of her stomach for the last 3 months hadn't left. Outside the grease-stained window, the neighborhood was changing. The old barber shop was boarded up. The bodega where she bought her spices was now a pile of rubble. The shadow of the Golden Lotus Corporation was swallowing her block, one family business at a time. They were building a casino, a glass and steel monstrosity that promised wealth but delivered displacement. Ruby was the last holdout. Her little soul food joint, inherited from her grandmother, sat right in the center of their proposed lobby. The bell above the front door chimed, but not with the usual enthusiastic jingle of a hungry regular. This was different. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. The few elderly patrons nursing their sweet teas went still. Ruby wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the swinging kitchen doors. Standing in the entrance were 4 men. 3 of them were mountains of muscle in dark suits, wearing earpieces and scowls that could curdle milk. But the 4th man, standing in the center, was the one who sucked the air out of the room. He was lithe, elegant, and terrifyingly handsome. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin, and his jet-black hair was swept back, revealing a sharp, angular face that betrayed zero emotion. This was Min-ho Kwon. The rumors said he was a businessman. The streets whispered that he was the head of a syndicate that didn't ask for permission. He was the man trying to erase her history. Min-ho looked around the small dining room, his gaze critical, dissecting the peeling paint in the corner and the mismatched chairs. He didn't look like a man who belonged here. He looked like a shark swimming in a goldfish bowl. He walked toward the counter, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the worn linoleum. Ruby didn't flinch. She stood her ground, crossing her arms over her chest. When he reached the counter, he placed a pristine white envelope on the laminate surface. "Ms. Williams," his voice was low, smooth, and carried a slight accent that made the dangerous words sound almost poetic. "My associates tell me you are being difficult. I decided to come personally to expedite this. The offer inside is double the market value. It is the final offer. You have 24 hours to vacate." Ruby looked at the envelope, then up at his dark, impenetrable eyes. "I don't need to open it," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "The answer is no. You can buy the bricks, Mr. Kwon, but you can't buy the soul of this place. My grandmother fed this neighborhood when the city turned its back on us. I'm not selling her legacy for a slot machine." One of the bodyguards stepped forward, his hand twitching toward his jacket, but Min-ho raised a single finger, stopping him instantly. He looked at Ruby with a flicker of genuine curiosity. People didn't say no to him. They certainly didn't look him in the eye while doing it. "Legacy," Min-ho repeated, tasting the word as if it were foreign. "Legacy does not pay bills, Ms. Williams, and legacy definitely does not stop bulldozers. Tomorrow morning the construction crews arrive. Whether you are inside or not is a matter of your own survival instinct." He turned to leave, dismissing her as if she were already a ghost. Anger flared in Ruby, hot and bright. "Wait," she called out. Min-ho stopped but didn't turn around. "You're going to destroy a place you've never even experienced," Ruby challenged, her voice ringing out in the quiet shop. "You think this is just a building. You don't know what you're crushing. Before you tear it down, you owe it to the history of this block to know what it tastes like." Min-ho turned slowly, his eyebrow arched. "Are you bargaining with food?" he asked, a hint of amusement dancing in his cold eyes. "I am telling you that if you walk out that door without trying my oxtails, you're not a businessman. You're a coward who destroys things because he doesn't understand them." The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut skin. The bodyguards looked nervous, waiting for the order to dismantle the shop and the woman. Instead, Min-ho unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat down at the nearest table. It was a challenge. "You have 10 minutes, he said, checking his platinum watch. "Impress me, or I sign the demolition order right here on this table." Ruby didn't waste a second. She spun on her heel and stormed into the kitchen. Her hands didn't shake. They worked with the precision of a surgeon. She plated the slow-braised oxtails, the meat falling off the bone, swimming in a rich, dark gravy that had been reducing for 12 hours. She added a scoop of 4-cheese mac and cheese with the crusty burnt edges, and a side of collard greens cooked with smoked turkey neck. She placed a square of honey-buttered cornbread on the side. She walked back out and placed the steaming plate in front of the Korean Mafia Boss. The smell hit him first, a wave of savory, complex spices that seemed to bypass his logic and hit something primal. Min-ho looked at the food, then at Ruby. She wasn't pleading anymore, she was waiting. He picked up the fork. The room held its breath. He took a piece of the oxtail, coated in gravy, and placed it in his mouth. Ruby watched his face. For a long second nothing happened, and then the mask slipped. His eyes widened imperceptibly. The flavor was explosive, rich, comforting, and deeply soulful. It didn't taste like restaurant food, it tasted like a memory he didn't know he had. It was warmth in a cold life. It was care. He took another bite, then some of the mac and cheese. The creaminess balanced the savory meat perfectly. He ate in silence, the 10-minute limit forgotten. His bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, confused by their boss's engagement with the cheap porcelain plate. When he finally set the fork down, the plate was clean. Min-ho sat back, looking at Ruby with a new expression. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was respect, mixed with something dangerous and possessive. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket, reached for the demolition order his assistant had placed on the table, and uncapped the pen. Ruby's heart stopped. She thought she had failed. Min-ho wrote something on the back of the document, then stood up, buttoning his jacket. "The demolition is postponed," he announced, his voice echoing in the small space. "For now." He signaled to his men, and they fell in line behind him. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her. "I will be back tomorrow at noon. If the smothered pork chops are as good as the oxtail, perhaps the building survives another day." He walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, leaving Ruby trembling, relieved, and terrified, realizing she had just entered a game with a predator, and her only weapon was her grandmother's recipes. But as the black SUVs pulled away inside the car, Min-ho looked at the demolition order. He hadn't signed it. He had written a single note to his bewildered underboss: delay the crew. Indefinitely. He looked out the window, the taste of the food still lingering, realizing that for the first time in years, he didn't want to destroy something. He wanted to own it. Routine established itself with a terrifying precision. Every day at noon, the black SUVs would swarm the curb like beetles. The street would go quiet, the neighborhood holding its breath as Min-ho Kwon stepped onto the pavement. For 2 weeks, the demolition crews sat idle 3 blocks away, their heavy machinery silent, costing the Golden Lotus Corporation thousands of dollars by the hour. Inside Ruby's iron skillet, the atmosphere had shifted from hostile negotiation to a strange, tense intimacy. Min-ho didn't just come for the food anymore, though he ate with a reverence that flattered Ruby's culinary pride. He came for the silence. In the chaos of his empire, where every handshake was a potential betrayal and every phone call a crisis, the small, humid dining room smelling of spices and lemon polish became his sanctuary. He had made his way through the smothered pork chops, then the shrimp and grits, and then a gumbo so thick and dark it looked like river mud and tasted like heaven. Ruby found herself prepping ingredients with him in mind, a realization that annoyed her as much as it frightened her. She was supposed to hate him. He was the wolf at the door. But it was hard to maintain pure hatred for a man who closed his eyes in genuine bliss when he bit into her peach cobbler. One rainy Tuesday, the dynamic shifted. Min-ho didn't sit at his usual table. Instead, he walked straight to the swinging doors of the kitchen. Ruby, elbow-deep in flour for biscuits, froze. "You can't be back here," she warned, wiping her hands on a rag. "Health code and common sense." Min-ho ignored her, leaning against the stainless steel prep table, his suit jacket discarded on a chair in the dining room, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by a faint, jagged scar. "My board of directors is screaming for blood," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. He picked up a slice of bell pepper she had just chopped. They want to know why a multi-million-dollar casino is being held hostage by a woman who cooks with bacon grease. And what do you tell them? Ruby asked, not looking up, focusing on rolling out the dough. The air between them was electric, charged with the heat of the ovens and the proximity of a dangerous man letting his guard down. I tell them I am negotiating, Minho replied, watching her hands move. But my Lieutenant Kang, he is not a patient man. He thinks I have lost my mind, or my edge. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Perhaps I have. Ruby stopped rolling. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the exhaustion etched around his eyes. Why are you doing this, Minho? She asked, using his first name for the first time. It's just food. Minho moved closer, encroaching on her personal space, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with the yeast. It is not just food, Ruby. It is the first thing in 20 years that has felt real. You cook like you have something to lose. Everyone I know cooks and lives like they are trying to take. The moment was shattered by the sound of the front door crashing open. The bell didn't jingle, it was ripped from the frame. Ruby jumped, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet instinctively. Minho's demeanor changed instantly. The tired man vanished, replaced by the predator. He moved in front of Ruby, shielding her body with his own as they stepped into the dining room. 3 men stood there. They weren't Minho's usual security detail. They were younger, hungrier, wearing leather jackets and holding baseball bats. Leading them was a man with bleached blonde hair and a sneer that showed gold teeth, Kang, Minho's second-in-command. The bodyguards Minho usually brought were nowhere to be seen. Kang had called them off. This was a coup, staged in the middle of a soul food restaurant. Boss, Kang said, stepping over a chair and kicking it aside. We were worried. You spend so much time here. We thought maybe you forgot the mission the elders sent me to remind you. He looked at Ruby with pure disgust. And to remove the distraction. Minho didn't raise his voice. He didn't even raise his hands. He stood perfectly still, a calm center in the storm. You made a mistake, Kang, Minho said, his voice dropping to a subterranean register that vibrated in the floorboards. You entered without knocking. Kang laughed, signaling his men to advance. It's a dump, Minho. We're doing the city a favor. One of the thugs swung his bat at a glass display case containing Ruby's grandmother's antique plates. The glass shattered, the sound exploding in the small room. Ruby cried out, but before she could move, Minho was in motion. It was a blur of violence so efficient it was almost beautiful. He sidestepped the first swing, grabbing the thug's wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack, using the man's momentum to throw him into the second attacker. Kang lunged, pulling a knife from his belt, but Minho was faster. He caught Kang's arm, drove a knee into his stomach, and slammed him face first onto the laminate table where he had eaten his lunch for the past 2 weeks. The table cracked under the force. Minho held Kang's face against the surface, his hand gripping the back of the lieutenant's neck like a vice. The other 2 men were groaning on the floor, incapacitated. Minho leaned down, whispering into Kang's ear but loud enough for Ruby to hear. This place is under my protection, not the clan's, mine. If you or anyone from the Golden Lotus touches a single brick or scares her again, I will not bury you. I will feed you to the pigs in the countryside. Do you understand? Kang gargled a response, terrified. Minho yanked him up and shoved him toward the door. Get out. Tell the elders I am handling the acquisition my way. And if they send dogs again, I will send back heads. The men scrambled out, battered and broken, leaving the door hanging on one hinge. Silence returned to the shop, heavy and jagged. Ruby stood trembling, the skillet still in her hand, her chest heaving. Minho straightened his suit, brushed a speck of dust from his lapel, and turned to her. There was blood on his knuckles, not his own. He looked at the shattered display case, then at Ruby's wide, fearful eyes. The barrier between them was gone. He was no longer just a customer. He was a violent force of nature who had just declared war on his own family for her. I apologize for the mess, Minho said, his breathing slightly elevated. I will have the door and the case replaced by evening. Ruby dropped the skillet. It clattered loudly. You just started a war, she whispered. Over lunch. Minho walked over to her, disregarding the broken glass crunching under his shoes. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray curl of hair behind her ear. His fingers were hot. "No," he corrected her, his eyes intense and dark. "I started a war because they tried to break the only thing I care about right now." He stepped back, his face hardening again. "Pack a bag, Ruby. You cannot stay here tonight. It is no longer safe." The drive to the penthouse took place in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of windshield wipers fighting a sudden torrential downpour. Ruby sat in the back of the armored SUV, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Minho was typing rapidly on his phone, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen, looking as if it were carved from marble. Now that the adrenaline of the brawl had faded, the reality of the situation crashed down on Ruby. She hadn't just argued with a developer, she was now at ground zero of a mafia war. The car dove into the subterranean garage of a glass and steel skyscraper, the headquarters of one of Minho's legitimate shell companies. A private elevator whisked them up 40 stories, the speed making Ruby's ears pop. When the doors slid open, she didn't step into a home, she stepped into a mausoleum. The penthouse was cavernous, terrifyingly clean and completely lifeless. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city Minho held in his fist, but inside, everything was shades of gray, black, and white. There were no photos, no trinkets, no scent of food, only the cold, sterile hum of central air conditioning. "Stay away from the glass," Minho said, tossing his ruined suit jacket onto a leather sofa that likely cost more than Ruby's entire restaurant. "It's bulletproof, but thermal scopes can still pick up heat signatures. Stay in the center of the room." Ruby wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "Is this your home?" she asked, her voice echoing off the empty walls. Minho paused, undoing his cufflinks. There was blood on his shirt, too. "This is where I sleep," he corrected. "I don't have a home, I have assets." He disappeared down a hallway, throwing back over his shoulder. "There should be food in the kitchen. I need to wash this off." "If the landline rings, do not answer it." Left alone, Ruby wandered into the kitchen. It looked like a showroom that had never seen a meal. The stove gleamed with factory polish. Inside the massive refrigerator there were only bottles of expensive water, a bottle of aged whiskey, and to Ruby's surprise, a lonely jar of kimchi and a carton of eggs. Apparently, even ruthless mob bosses had late-night cravings. Instinct took over fear. For Ruby, cooking was the only way to order chaos. As long as her hands were moving, she didn't have to think about the target on her back. She found a bag of rice in the pantry and an old wok hidden in the back of a cupboard. Within 20 minutes, the sound of sizzling oil and the rhythmic chop of a knife against a board were the only living sounds in the tomb-like apartment. She turned the meager ingredients into kimchi bokkeumbap, fried rice, rich and spicy, topped with a perfectly fried egg with a runny yolk. The smell of toasted sesame and gochugaru drifted through the sterile air, banishing the cold. When Minho returned, he was wearing simple black sweatpants and a t-shirt. With his hair wet and falling over his forehead, stripped of his armored suit, he looked younger and more vulnerable. He froze at the threshold of the kitchen, inhaling the scent. For the first time, Ruby saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, replacing the calculation. "You cooked," he said quietly, as if stating a miracle. "It's what I do," Ruby replied, sliding a plate across the granite island. "Eat. You'll need strength to explain why half the underworld wants us dead." Minho sat on a high bar stool and picked up a spoon. He ate in silence, quickly, with the same desperate hunger she had seen in the restaurant. When the plate was empty, he pushed it away and looked at her. "The Golden Lotus is not just a gang. It is a corporation managed by a council of elders. I was their enforcer, the one who brings profit and removes problems. But by refusing to demolish your block, I showed weakness. And in our world, weakness is a capital offense." Ruby listened, panic rising in her chest, but she kept her face steady. "So what happens now?" she asked. Minho stood up and walked around the island, stopping dangerously close to her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling the soap and the faint, metallic scent of danger that seemed to cling to his skin. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle. "Now it is us against them," he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I could have given them the block, I could have paid them off. But when I eat your food, Ruby, I remember what it feels like to be human, not a machine. I don't want to go back. I will burn this city to ash before I let them touch you." The air between them crackled, the tension shifting from fear to something deeper, magnetic. Ruby realized that despite the danger, there was nowhere else she wanted to be. She covered his hand with her own. But the moment was shattered by a piercing, high-pitched siren. The lights in the penthouse flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, illuminated only by the city lights below. Minho's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked the screen, his face hardening into stone. "They are here," he whispered, grabbing Ruby's arm. "Kang didn't wait for the morning. They've cut the building's hardline security. We have 3 minutes before the elevator overrides reach this floor." He pulled her away from the kitchen, guiding her into the shadows of the hallway. "Where are we running?" Ruby gasped. Minho kicked open a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a duffel bag and 2 handguns. "We aren't running," he said, checking the magazine of a pistol with terrifying calm. "We are hunting. But first, I have to get you out of this glass cage alive." The elevator chimed, a cheerful sound that felt grotesquely out of place in the darkened penthouse. Before the doors could fully slide open, Minho fired 3 shots through the gap. There was a shout of surprise, followed by the chaotic return fire of automatic weapons. Glass shattered everywhere, raining down like diamonds. Minho didn't flinch. He grabbed Ruby by the waist and hauled her behind a heavy marble pillar just as bullets chewed up the drywall where they had been standing seconds before. "Service stairwell," he barked over the noise, his voice tight with controlled adrenaline. "Move." They sprinted across the open space, staying low. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nose, a sharp, metallic scent that was a terrifying contrast to the warm spices she was used to. Minho kicked open the heavy fire door, ushering her into the concrete stairwell, and jammed a steel pipe from the wall mount into the handle to bar the door behind them. They could hear the heavy thud of bodies hitting the door from the other side, followed by cursing in Korean. They didn't run down, they ran up. "The roof," Ruby gasped, her lungs burning as they climbed the 2 flights to the helipad access. "Too exposed," Minho replied, not slowing down. He didn't lead her to a helicopter but to a maintenance shed on the roof's edge. Inside was a heavy-duty construction winch and a zipline rig that connected to the lower roof of the adjacent office building, another one of his assets. "Hold on to me," he commanded, strapping them both into the harness. "Do not look down." Before Ruby could protest, he kicked off the ledge. For 10 terrifying seconds they were flying through the rain and the neon-lit smog of the city, suspended over a 100-foot drop. They landed hard on the gravel roof across the gap, rolling to absorb the impact. Minho was up instantly, cutting the line. He pulled Ruby to her feet, checking her quickly for injuries. His eyes were wild, scanning the perimeter, but when they landed on her face, they softened momentarily. "You are doing well," he whispered, "better than my men." They descended through the empty office building to a subterranean garage where a nondescript sedan was waiting under a tarp. Minho drove with the lights off until they were miles away, navigating the labyrinthine back alleys of the city to avoid traffic cameras. He finally pulled up to an abandoned industrial bakery in the warehouse district. It was a ghost of a building, smelling of old flour and rust. Once inside, Minho engaged the heavy steel shutters and finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. He slumped slightly against a rusted industrial mixer, clutching his side. Ruby rushed to him, pulling his hand away. His shirt was soaked in blood, a graze deep and ugly just above his hip. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling but her hands steady. "Sit down. Now." She found a first aid kit in the stash of supplies Minho kept there, alongside weapons and cash. The dynamic shifted again. In the penthouse, he was the protector. Here, bleeding and pale, he needed her. Ruby cut away his shirt, cleaning the wound with rubbing alcohol. Minho hissed through his teeth but didn't look away from her face. "Why?" Ruby asked softly, applying pressure to the wound. "You have billions, Minho. You could have left the country. You could have sold the block." Why take a bullet for a restaurant? Minho reached out, his hand covering hers on his waist. The blood made their skin stick together. It wasn't for the restaurant, Ruby, he said, his voice raspy. I have lived my whole life eating cold food in empty rooms. I have been hungry for a long time. You were the first thing that felt like home. The raw honesty of the moment stripped away the last of their defenses. The danger outside had compressed their world down to this dim, dusty room. Ruby looked at this dangerous, beautiful man who had upended her life, and she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who was desperate to be saved. She leaned in, and Minho met her halfway. The kiss tasted of iron and rain, desperate and consuming. It wasn't a gentle romance. It was a collision of two people trying to prove they were still alive. His hand tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, as if he could absorb her warmth to replace the coldness of his world. For a few minutes, there was no mafia, no demolition orders, just the heat of their bodies and the sound of the rain drumming on the metal roof. Minho pulled back slowly, resting his forehead against hers. Kang thinks I am running, he murmured, his eyes dark and focused again. He will call a meeting with the elders at sunrise. They will meet at the construction site of the casino to symbolize their victory and my erasure. He stood up, wincing slightly, but the weakness was gone. He walked to a metal crate and pried it open, revealing a terrifying array of firepower. He began loading a shotgun with methodical precision. I am not running. Ruby stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She felt a cold resolve settle in her gut. She wasn't just a cook anymore, she was a survivor. You're going to the site, she stated. Minho corrected, turning to face her. He handed her a small, heavy pistol. I cannot leave you here alone. If I fail, they will come for you. If we end this, we end it together. Ruby weighed the gun in her hand. It felt foreign, heavy, but strangely fitting. I prefer a cast-iron skillet, she said with a shaky smile. Minho actually laughed, a dry, sharp sound. Tomorrow, he promised, I will buy you 1,000 skillets, but first we have to take out the trash. He checked his watch. The sun rises in 4 hours. Let's go prepare the final course. The construction site for the Golden Lotus Casino was a graveyard of steel and mud, shrouded in the gray mist of early dawn. The skeletal framework of the first floor rose like the ribcage of a great beast, casting long, jagged shadows. In the center of the clearing, illuminated by the headlights of 3 SUVs, sat the elders, 3 elderly men in pristine suits sitting on folding chairs, sipping tea as if watching a play. Kang stood before them, packing nervously, his gold teeth flashing as he checked his watch. He had promised them Minho's head on a platter by sunrise. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and impending violence. Minho did not sneak in. He drove the battered sedan straight through the chain-link gate, the engine roaring, and screeched to a halt 20 yards from the group. The gathered thugs raised their weapons instantly. Minho stepped out, hands raised, his face bruised but his posture regal. He wore the blood-stained t-shirt like a uniform. I am here, he called out, his voice cutting through the morning fog. Let's finish the board meeting. Kang laughed, a nervous, hacking sound. You came alone to die. He signaled his men, kill him. Wait, the command didn't come from Minho, but from the darkness behind the heavy machinery. A massive floodlight suddenly snapped on, blinding Kang and his men. From the cabin of a towering crane overlooking the site, Ruby's voice boomed over the construction radio system Minho had hacked into. Anyone who shoots, she announced, her voice trembling slightly but loud, gets buried. The crane's arms swung ominously, a ton of steel rebar dangling directly over the elders' expensive cars. It was a bluff. Ruby barely knew how to operate the levers Minho had shown her, but it was enough. The thugs hesitated, looking up at the swaying death above. In that split second of confusion, Minho moved. He drew the shotgun from his back holster and fired not at the men but at the ground in front of them, kicking up a wall of mud and gravel that acted as a smokescreen. He dove behind a stack of cinder blocks as chaos erupted. Gunfire crisscrossed the site. Minho moved like a phantom, flanking the confused mercenaries. He didn't kill, he incapacitated, shooting knees and shoulders with surgical precision. He was dismantling his own army to save it. Kang, realizing he was losing control, screamed in rage and charged toward Minho's position, firing blindly. Minho waited. When Kang rounded the corner of the concrete pillar, Minho stepped out, knocking the gun from his hand with the stock of the shotgun. The two men collided, rolling into the mud. It was a brutal, ugly fight. Kang fought with desperation, pulling a knife, slashing at Minho's arm. But Minho fought with the cold fury of a man protecting his future. He caught Kang's wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped, and delivered a single, thunderous punch that laid his former lieutenant out flat in the muck. Silence fell over the sight. The mercenaries lowered their weapons, looking from their fallen leader to the man who had led them for years. Minho stood over Kang, chest heaving, rain mixing with the blood on his face. He looked up at the crane where Ruby was watching, then turned to the elders. He walked toward them, ignoring the bodyguards who stepped aside, sensing the shift in power. Minho stopped in front of the oldest man, the chairman. Kang offered you a casino, Minho said, wiping mud from his eye. I offer you survival. You can try to kill me and the woman in that crane, but you will lose your best earner and the police are already on their way. I called them 10 minutes ago. Or, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, we forget this project. We build the casino 3 miles south on the land I bought under a shell company last week. The neighborhood stays, the restaurant stays, and I return to making you money. The chairman looked at the ruined construction site, at the unconscious Kang, and finally at the fierce determination in Minho's eyes. He nodded slowly. The south lot is acceptable. Clean up this mess, Minho. 6 months later. The sign above the door had been repainted, Ruby and Kwon's iron skillet. The interior was full, the lunch rush in full swing. The walls were freshly painted a warm butter yellow, and the broken display case had been replaced with reinforced glass. But the smell was the same, the grounding, soulful aroma of paprika, thyme, and love. Ruby stood at the pass, wiping a plate of fried catfish. She looked tired, but it was a good tired. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Minho walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple white apron over a black t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint scar of a bullet wound on his side. He carried a crate of fresh collard greens from the delivery truck. The terrifying mafia boss who had once threatened to bulldoze the block was now arguing with suppliers about the price of okra. He set the crate down and walked over to her. The kitchen staff, 2 sturdy aunties from the neighborhood and a former bodyguard of Minho's who had discovered a passion for baking cornbread, pretended not to watch. Minho wrapped his arms around Ruby's waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The city inspector is happy, he murmured into her ear, and the elders are enjoying their dividends from the new location. That's nice, Ruby said, leaning back into him. But table 4 is waiting for their grits, and if you don't get those onions chopped, I'm going to fire you. Minho laughed, a sound that came easily to him now. He turned her around and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of second chances. Yes, chef, he said with a wink. He picked up a knife and went to the prep station. Outside, the neighborhood was noisy and alive, safe in the shadow of the restaurant that refused to move, anchored by a woman with a skillet and a man who had finally found his soul.